So I fell in love with India, with the complexity of it, but also with the similarities. When I first talked with farmers, I learned that they were concerned about sending their children to school, about their children having something better than they had. They were concerned about if they would be able to break even on their crops that year. Of course, this is in the winter, so they're growing winter crops, and concerned about where they were going to get their funds for their inputs for the next season, right? All those kinds of things. That sounded very familiar to me. And so from then on, I returned to the U.S. and took summer intensive Hindi courses, and then have been locked in ever since. Yeah.
I mean, it's really interesting when I read your work to realize that how much of the inequities you see in the water sector are just reproducing the inequities in society, because engineering a water system rarely magically solves an underlying gender or caste or class problem. It's generally reproducing those.
The water sector reflects society, and society reflects the water sector. And I think that, as you know, these are really complex challenges. You pull a thread and then the whole thing unravels. My students were trying to do this is harness the data revolution and the AI revolution. I don't think anybody really knows where that's going. We've seen some insights. In some ways, there have been some very interesting discoveries. In others, it's being used to sell people things, create better adverts on what we might want or not know what we want. So I think that's part of it. I don't want to be naive about this, but I think from a farmer's perspective, having data and information isn't necessarily knowledge, but it can lead to knowledge, and knowledge is empowering.
Welcome to the Water Data Podcast, where we talk about the science, the stories, and the systems that shape our water future. I'm your host, Veena Srinivasan. Every couple of weeks, we'll chat about how better data and evidence can result in better decision-making and ultimately better outcomes for people and the planet. So if you're a student, a researcher, an innovator, a practitioner, or just curious about how we can better manage this precious resource, you've come to the right place. Let's get started. Hello. Today it's my privilege and pleasure to host Professor Trevor Birkenholtz. Trevor is a professor in the Department of Geography at Penn State University, and he's a longtime scholar of water in India. Trevor, you're one of the first people that we've had who's a card-carrying qualitative social scientist who studied water in India for so many decades now. And so it's a real pleasure to host you here, and welcome to the Water Data Podcast.
Oh, thank you, Veena. I'm thrilled to be here. Yeah, it's great.
Trevor, for the audience of this podcast, we've had a lot of very technical episodes, and I think some of the terminology and even the way you think about water might be unfamiliar. So I'm going to actually start by describing what I think, or the way I describe your work, is critical social sciences. But I was wondering, how do you describe yourself as a scientist or a water researcher? How do you describe your disciplinary approach? Can you give us, explain that to us?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So I'm a critical social scientist, and I define myself as a political ecologist and development scholar, professor of geography. And so political ecology is a field that kind of emerged in the 1980s from natural hazards research. And there's a recognition that natural hazards research, while important, wasn't getting at root causes of environmental degradation. So political ecologists are interested, broadly speaking, in access to and control over natural resources and the social power relations involved and the policy implications. And then the critical development studies part of that is thinking about this in what we used to call developing context. I think about them as undergoing rapid change, actually, where economies, politics, livelihoods are in flux and changing.
Great. So can you unpack for us broadly critical development studies? What does that actually entail? What does a critical development study researcher do?
I think one of the main insights is an attempt to try to understand the way that emerging economies, like all economies, are embedded in nested scales of economic transactions globally and processes. And so that we can't understand this is going back to the 1980s and 1990s. We can't understand what's happening in the Sahel without understanding who the people who are living there, what they're growing, who they're selling it to, what they're buying, how they're impacted by that, by global exchange, by global politics and economic process. And so it's a recognition that we're all embedded in something larger, and we try to understand how that embeddedness impacts people's livelihoods and what they do and how they do it, maybe why they do it.
Fantastic. I mean, there's a very clear analogy to the hydrology side, because you can't understand what happens in a farm if you don't understand what's happening in the river basin, if water is being moved around or there's interbasin transports. But you can't understand what happens at a river basin without understanding global teleconnections of the Indian
That's
monsoon
right.
and so on. So in a sense, it's a telescoping. You can't understand what's happening in a given place if you also don't understand what's happening, except you're looking at it from a human perspective and not a
That's right.
physical, biophysical flows of water perspective.
Absolutely. And this perspective really emerged in the post-World War II period, where economies were coming back together in a way after, a period of upheaval in the early 20th century, and trying to raise development in terms of economic development, food security, human health, and capacity building globally, and a recognition that that would lead to more stable, global politics. Then that filtered down into academia in a way, and then scholars recognized, as we're wont to do, that there were problems with the way the states envisioned development. Those could hopefully be rectified through careful study and analysis, and then feeding back up into the policy process.
Fantastic. We will talk about that a little later. So also explain to me in terms of the methods, right? This is primarily qualitative research, but for a lot of the people that listen to this podcast who come maybe from the more data, side of things, or they come from the remote sensing or from the hydrological modeling, this is probably very alien. Do you go and interview, talk to a lot of people? How do you formulate hypothesis? How do you draw your frame around what's an interesting question? What's the process?
Sure. Yeah. So I engage in what's called mixed methods social science research, so quantitative and qualitative. It depends on the question, which I can talk a bit about. Maybe I'll just say in quantitative social science, we're looking for empirical generalizability, trying to be able to predict. And to do that, we need to have a sample that represents the population. And I would say, in order to do that, one must really understand the population, the context within which they're embedded. And where qualitative social science comes in is qualitative science, social science is very much interested in understanding why people do what they do. What are their motivations? In order to then form a quantitative side of a project, we must understand something about motivations and intentionality and meaning, really. What is it that we're engaged in on a daily basis, and what does it mean to us? And that's a part that over the last decade or 15 years of my career I've been the most interested in. And so in terms of qualitative research, when I talk to my students, I say we're looking for why questions, why people do what they do. In qualitative research, we form hypotheses, mostly as working hypotheses, that through the process of research, that may change, actually. We may change based on our understanding, so it's an inductive form of research.
Got it.
Now, of course, because we read the literature prior to doing any research project, we have a sense of the deductive aspect. We know what we're looking for, but we're open to surprise. And versus a more quantitative project where we might carry through with the experiment to disprove a hypothesis or to prove one. In qualitative work, we may alter the project midstream to say this is not what we thought it was going to be. We're asking the wrong question. So I think that's one of the strengths, and they work very well together. You'll find in social science some scientists who are wedded to a quantitative or qualitative approach. And I see them as very complementary to one another, being able to ask different kinds of questions to develop a better understanding of human decision-making and how we might enable humans to lead more productive and happy lives.
Got it. Just one question though. When we've been doing some of our qualitative research and interviews, each human being is different. So how do you generalize to that landscape? But how do you even tell a story if every person is so different? How do you go from individual stories, which are rich and interesting and are in human interest, but how do you go from that to something which is a theory or something that you can say about a landscape? What's that process of?
Yeah, I think, rigor in qualitative research, there are a couple of concepts that I think are really important. The first is saturation. So depending on how heterogeneous a population is, what we would normally do, and I'm skipping over some details, but we would continue to interview, say in this case, farmers, in my work on groundwater irrigating farmers, I would continue to interview farmers about some particular topic until I reached data saturation, until I'm not getting any new stories from any farmers. And that's how I would know that I had a complete picture. Second, I would triangulate that. So triangulation is very important. So in addition to interviews, I might form focus groups to then put out some hot potatoes, to put out some topics that I learned through my interviews to see if everyone in the room agrees or where the disagreement lies. And then third, once I think I have some findings, I would represent them back to the participant community to say, this is what I think you told me. Is this what you were trying to tell me? And then I think also another aspect that's really important is participant observation. And one thing I think I've seen with, and this is from research, is that humans are really bad at answering questions and telling you what we did. So for instance, if I asked you about your day, you would make a good faith effort to tell me about your day from start to finish. But if I observed you all day, what you were doing, I would see things that you didn't report to me.
Because I'm not self-aware
Because you're
enough,
just not thinking of it.
I just took it for granted.
Right? And I would say, well, you didn't tell me yesterday when I asked you all the things that you did today that you have a second cup of chai at 11 a.m. or something like that, right? So now I'm telling you to do this. Why do you do that? Why do you think that you didn't think to report that to me? And in my work with groundwater irrigating farmers, when I participate and observe them going about their daily routines, I see lots of things that they didn't think to tell me. It's not because they're trying not to tell me.
Yeah.
It's because we just, as humans, I think we don't always think that critically about what we do about the day.
Oh, because we think different things are important.
Different things are important. We're focused on different aspects, and we overlook things. And so those things taken together, saturation, triangulation of method, reporting back to our participant community are all really important.
How do you disaggregate communities? So how do you know farmer versus farmer in Rajasthan versus farmer in Alwar district versus farmer with a borewell versus farmer with a borewell but a brother in Delhi? Like at what level do you need to typify or categorize participants in order to get meaningful stories? How do you know this is granular enough or it's too granular now?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. I think a couple things come to mind. It does depend on the question. So with qualitative research, we're often not looking for, as I said before, empirical generalizability, but conceptual generalizability. So we're trying to form theory and concepts that do vary over space in similar ways and between different groups. And they may vary differently between different groups. That's one of the things we're interested in. We know from the literature, large farmers and small farmers have some variation in terms of maybe the kinds of crops they grow, the decision-making process into how they decide what to grow and who they sell it to. We know that class in terms of landholding size and assets co-varies with caste in many parts of India. We know that there, because of the research again in historical literature, that there are gender differences. So we, as I said, it's an inductive approach, but we don't go in with a blank slate. We know certain things that we're looking for. We're looking for cases that either confirm that or disconfirm that. And so I think over space, then we need to also think about local markets. We need to think about local resource use systems. So that may be alluvial aquifers of Rajasthan or hard rock aquifers of Karnataka. Those lead to different kinds of crops, different kinds of markets, different kinds of agricultural practices. And we know that from the literature to a degree as well. And so there are going to be some similarities, but there are going to be very interesting differences. And it's in the differences, then we can ask, why do we get these differences over space? And maybe that's I think every good research project ends with more questions. And so that's part of the theory generation, but also the research question generation.
Got it. So you're starting with understanding from the literature, what we already know about how people behave, so on and so forth. But then you're listening deeply and then allowing new surprises to emerge, saying, okay, nobody's ever thought about that aspect affecting how resources are accessed or used. And so now maybe I'll branch off a little bit because 3 or 4 people have now said this interesting thing which the literature didn't talk about. And that's kind of giving you your clue about where to probe. Is that
that's right. And I think in that way too that as I was talking about before, because the approach of political ecology and development studies has emerged globally through research in Western and Eastern and South Africa and parts of India and Nepal and Latin America, that we have insights from all those places that are different, but some similarities. And that's another aspect I think that's interesting about qualitative research, is that you kind of understand the contexts in which people operate are similar, but they're different. And so in those differences, we can understand what levers we might be able to pull to be able to enhance livelihoods and what ones may not work in certain contexts.
Got it. Fantastic. That is a much longer kind of deep dive into research methods than I usually do, but I felt it was important for us to start. So let's start with your history of now 2.5 decades of work in India. What brought you to work on water in India? How did that process start?
Yeah, so I started my master's PhD program, a joint program at Ohio State in 2000. And I came in with a background, having grown up in a farming community. My father's side of the family were and are farmers. And I started graduate school, and I was working on something very different in my master's, actually looking at urban lawns. And I went to Ohio State to work with Paul Robbins. And I had a set of concerns that I was interested in studying for my PhD, which included technology, because I've historically been interested in machinery. And then second, question around agriculture and agrarian change. And then third, as an undergraduate, I'd worked for the U.S. Geological Survey, and I was a hydrologist trainee in the USGS in the U.S. as this great program where they'd hire undergraduate students with the idea that you're going to finish your education, they're going to train you as a hydrologist, and then you would be hired at the end. And this is in the late 90s, and there was a hiring freeze from the federal government when I graduated. And as a trainee, it was tied to me being a student. So they were unable to continue to employ me. And so I went in a different direction. So that's a little bit of the background. On the hydrologist side of things, I thought I was going to be a natural scientist. To go back to the part of the story that's more important, is that finishing my master's, I knew what I wanted to study, but I didn't know where I wanted to study it. And I think even coming out of a master's, I was pretty globally ignorant in many ways. I had ideas and I had read, but I hadn't been to a lot of places. And so as I was finishing my master's, my advisor, Paul Robbins, was going on sabbatical, and he had been researching for over a decade at that point in Rajasthan in northern India. And he said, if you can find a little bit of money, you can come along, see if this could be a place that you'd want to do your dissertation work. And so I did. And I spent a little over a month in 2001, 2002, December, January. He introduced me to some of his colleagues in Rajasthan, including the late Komal Kothari, who forgot more about Rajasthan than most people will ever know. I think was just a wonderful, generous human being. With his family, I hired a family member to take me out and to serve as translator, and we went to some farming areas. And I'm still working with that research assistant today, Jaiwant Mehta, lives in Jaipur. We've known each other for over 20 years, dear friend. And to where sometimes the research doesn't matter, where the friendship is what matters. But so I fell in love with India, with the complexity of it, but also with the similarities. So when I first talked with farmers, I learned that they were concerned about sending their children to school, about their children having something better than they had. They were concerned about if they would be able to break even on their crops that year. Of course, this is in the winter, so they're growing winter crops, and concerned about where they were going to get their funds for their inputs for the next season, right? All those kinds of things. That sounded very familiar to me. And so that part I was familiar with, but then I was also absolutely fascinated by this Borewell revolution that was happening starting at that period that had been around for quite a while, but because of electrification in the countryside, farmers were transitioning from these shallow dug wells with diesel pumps to electrically driven pumps. And I thought that was really interesting. And so from then on, I returned to the U.S. and took summer intensive Hindi courses, and then have been locked in ever since.
Yeah. So what were some of your early findings? I mean, I'd love for you to also reflect on, now you've been about 2.5 decades in the same landscape of Rajasthan. What have you kind of seen change over those 2.5 decades, specifically with respect to agrarian systems and groundwater? But then what were some of your early findings on groundwater?
I think some of the early impactful findings were that how scarcity led to collective action initially. So in the mid-2000s, the bore wells going in were fairly shallow. They were going into alluvial aquifers, mostly perched aquifers. And because not every farm had electricity, because farmers had to chip in and pay something to get a connection and a three-phase connection for a tube well pump, not everyone had one. And so if one farmer would invest, and then other farmers would pay that farmer for borewell time. And so that led to a kind of collective action that was unanticipated around the kind of demands and constraints and opportunities of that technology. But also,
is that collective action or just tube well markets like Navroz Dubash wrote about tube well capitalism?
That was inspirational for me. Yeah, tube well capitalism. A little bit different because in that story there were markets that formed. Here it wasn't so much markets. It was that there would be a borewell in a central kind of pivot area, and the farmers that were adjacent to that would pay for some of that borewell time. But it was also...
Were they jointly investing in the borewell itself, though?
No, it was owned by one.
So it was still more like a market, though.
Kind of like a market with very little guarantees, actually.
Right.
If you're the farmer with the borewell and I'm the one who wants to buy some of the time, meaning I want to get some of water for irrigation, if you decide at any point that you don't have enough, then I might be out. But then that's where it relied on kind of kinship networks broadly defined, some like actual kinships versus like familiar relations over time. So it's very interesting thinking about these different layers of connection and responsibility that was also familiar to me and in the community. That was some of the early work, and what I think was interesting, even at that time, 2004, 2005, when I was doing my dissertation work, that farmers all thought that groundwater was finished. They all thought that eventually they would be out of the farming business in terms of maybe engaged in rain-fed agriculture, but not irrigated, so going down to one crop per year during the summer months, and that their children would need to find work outside the farm. And of course, there was a lot of development economics at the time that predicted the evolution of Indian agriculture, where the peasant farmer would go away, the small-scale farmer would disappear into these economies of scale, and that it would look more like the U.S. or Europe. And that hasn't happened.
No, but the trend is kind of eventually going in that way.
There is a trend there, yeah. What I've been a side aspect that's just been interesting is the degree to which farmers don't want to give up their land. And so if they can maintain some aspect of their land, of course, there are other factors too of patrilineal land inheritance. So farms have gotten smaller. That's also become more complicated, I think, between households that are related.
Can I ask you about the kinship network? Can you explain that? Because did you mean that they were more likely to give time to somebody who was either from their own extended family or caste rather than somebody from another caste? Is that what that means?
Yeah, I found, at least in this part of Rajasthan, very few intercaste relationships, and that's because the villages were caste defined, segregated, And that's where another kind of lesson from political ecology is that these long histories in which contemporary action is embedded are important, right? So those histories come out of kind of partial land reform in the 40s and 50s. At that time, the colonial period, dominant groups were on good land, more marginalized groups were on more marginal land, and that continues into the present. And that was clear then as well. In terms of one of the things I measured in my study was how deep bore wells were, and there were some differences. Scheduled castes and scheduled tribes often didn't have bore wells; they were engaged in one crop per year, whereas at that time the more dominant castes were the ones able to invest in bore wells. And then there are all kinds of, in terms of access to capital, money lenders and that sort of thing, that there were favors in that way. And I think part of that's changed over the last 20 years. You asked what's changed. And I would say that with the affirmative systems of reservation systems having more scheduled castes and decision-making authority in panchayats and local leadership has made an impact. And I think generally that's been positive.
And also loan schemes that favor
loan schemes, right, through formal channels, which have also been were difficult early on because of lack of land title and that sort of thing. So the number of factors that would feed into each other that would lead to kind of a reproduction of existing asymmetry. That I think there have been some really long, hard-fought victories there on the part of the state and central government.
If you find this episode to be valuable, please like the video and check out more episodes of the show. And don't forget to subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel. And if you think someone else, maybe a colleague, a student, a friend, or a fellow water enthusiast, might find this show useful, do share it with them. We hope to reach many more change makers like you. I mean, it's really interesting when I read your work to realize that how much of the inequities you see in the water sector are just reproducing the inequities in society, because engineering a water system rarely magically solves an underlying, either gender or caste or class problem. It's generally reproducing those. But then the other way, if you actually solve some of those root problems, you actually see improvements in resource allocation. So it seems like there's we can't expect the water infrastructure problems to solve them, but they do reflect and benefit from gains that are made to fundamental societal structures. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I think so. I think they reflect each other, right? And so the water sector reflects society, and society reflects the water sector. And I think that, as you know, these are really complex challenges. You pull a thread, and then the whole thing unravels. And some of my work right now, and maybe we'll get to this, but on large-scale water infrastructure and surface water infrastructure. 2 years ago, I had the opportunity to interview a pretty high-level person in the Rajasthan Water Resources Department who's responsible for the Eastern Rajasthan Canal Project. And trained as an engineer, I developed so much respect for water engineers at that time. Of course, in the literature, they're often derided, in terms of looking at technical solutions, et cetera. And he had a map of what districts in Rajasthan would be served, and supplying water to them, he viewed it as his responsibility.
Yeah. Well, let's come back to the infrastructure stuff, because that's important. Let's stick with groundwater for a few minutes more. Have the groundwater levels in this place dropped? Or they've stayed more or less the same?
So there are deep aquifers and shallow aquifers. The deep ones have certainly dropped. A lot of my work has been in Jaipur district, but I've worked in Western Rajasthan as well and in other areas. Going back to one of your questions around like extensifying qualitative research, I've tried to do that around adaptation to climate change. And so in the western part of Rajasthan, near the Jodhpur area and Pali, those are deep aquifers, hard rock. But in Jaipur and that part of Rajasthan, in the eastern part, they're alluvial. They're going for deep water also. But these are perched aquifers. So kind of interestingly, farmers will dry them up every year, and then if they get a decent monsoon rain, they'll fill back up and they can pump them again.
Right.
And there's some adaptations in the hard rock areas where they've dug diggies and other things for artificial recharge that have been very effective.
Right.
So I think that's, going back to what I was saying before, how farmers 20 years ago all thought that groundwater would be finished. I think this has enabled the kind of like the aquifer system really has enabled 2 or 3, even 3 cropping seasons to continue.
One thing that you see from the climate model forecast, though, is that Rajasthan is predicted to get wetter, and it's also where historically, if you look at the trends in rain, actually there has been increasing rainfall trends, and I wonder to what extent some of this is the benefits of climate change, if you want to call it that, unintended but benefits, and how much of that is work done. It's probably a combination of the two, because more rain is always, good for recharge, right? And then, of course, the work that you do on putting in recharge structures is over and above that. Different question. In terms of the types of crops that were being grown, have you seen changes there? Has it become, more subsistence earlier on with like more bajra type of things, and now more cash crop? What's happened with that?
Yeah, more cash crops by and large, kind of predictably. But I think, interestingly, with the central government's All India Pro-Millet Improvement Project that's been long going, then with efforts maybe going back 15 years to try to reposition millets, bajra, as a climate adaptive crop, but also like a very nutritious. There are a lot of efforts there, and so I think we did see a resurgence a little bit in bajra in certain places that was viewed as a
and prices have improved as well.
Prices improved, right? Yeah, and you see it in nice restaurants in Delhi, for instance, that you wouldn't have seen 20 years ago, certainly. And there is that ongoing. But one of the interesting things I've seen most recently, meaning in the last 5 years, is that farmers, like here in Karnataka, are putting in polyhouses, putting in greenhouses, and that enables them to grow off-season varieties. So things like bindi in the winter, for instance, that wasn't there before. Now they're growing and they're able to fetch a good price in the market. What I think is also interesting is that markets still are very local there. So even outside of Jaipur, they're mostly in Jaipur. Those markets, some are going maybe to further in Rajasthan, but very,
not really to Delhi.
Very little to going to Delhi. Yeah,
right.
And so mostly in that region.
So far, it all sounds mostly rosy. These people, they put in the Borewells, they made money. This has enabled them to invest more capital. They're now growing high-value crops. All this sounds great. But you also said there were pockets of depletion. So what's happening in those pockets?
Yeah, in those pockets, I think there's two things. There's depletion that I see as also, it's not related in a causal way, but they're also like challenges around labor in this area and outward migration. So you have men moving, but going into the cities, going into Jaipur, going into even Delhi sometimes for work. And so we have this depletion, but we also have changes in the labor dynamic that I think lead to different unexpected outcomes.
Yeah.
And so what I see there in some cases is depletion is leading to smaller, more intensive production, almost like garden production of tomatoes, for instance. That is very gendered work, actually. Women perform most of that work.
Because only the women are left behind, and
women are left
that's
behind.
What they can do.
Yeah, and they're growing tomatoes on very intensive. I have some photos where this is like jungle almost. I mean, the tomato plants are so close together. They're being irrigated through a sprinkler on the surface, but also through drip lines. But in some depletion areas, then there are returns to more traditional cropping varieties, returns to one crop per year, where farmers have had difficulty making ends meet on a second crop. And in that case, though, too, there's more off-farm diversification. So depending on how close you are, in this case to Jaipur, there have been a number of new garment industries that have gone up, very intentional by the Rajasthan government and development corporation. And so those places are offering stable employment, sometimes climate controlled in the summer, which is very important to people, and a steady paycheck. And so that's become very attractive to the kind of constant unknowns of agriculture.
Yeah.
And so I think more people have one foot in the formal sector and then one in the agricultural sector. And so based on some of my research, recent interviews, is that the agricultural production part of it is less important for their livelihoods than the other parts.
I mean, this is exactly what we're finding in Karnataka as well, because we always think about, as water researchers, we kind of draw a circle around farmers and say we want to study farmers and agriculture. But farmers, for them, their life is a portfolio of all kinds of livelihood opportunities.
Absolutely.
And you see these patterns. I mean, the thing that you said earlier, that they don't want to lose control of ancestral land, because often that's their biggest asset. And they're always, prices are going up. They know that they want to hang on to it, but you can't hang on to it because you can't squeeze enough income over shrinkingly small land holdings. So you see a lot of these patterns of people going. One person will go to the city for a few years and come back,
right.
and maybe leaving the wife behind, or the wife and children behind, and then they are doing some labor and kind of eking out an existence. But it's really the urban off-farm incomes that are sustaining the village life.
Yeah.
You see that over and over again. It's interesting because then it becomes harder to predict whether you're going to see consolidation. Eventually, will they give up the land, or will there still be, or rather will the city all come into the villages where, software companies are setting up, call centers or whatever, BPOs or whatever else, or factories, and that's going to be like, what's that going to look like?
Yeah, and it's interesting too, going back to the seasonal migration aspect of it, going into villages, and this phenomenon has been described in Nepal, actually, where a lot of young men go abroad to work, and being in villages where there are no men in their 20s.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
all they're
And then they come back in their 50s because they're done with that. They've got some
right.
earning. They can put that in the bank and then live a much higher quality of life.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So it's a very different social environment
Yeah.
right now, and I think a lot of precarity for women also. In terms of because if their husband is in Jaipur, Delhi, working, they're reliant on their income coming back.
Yeah.
They may or may not send it on a timely fashion. Right. Things happen, and meanwhile they're working and trying to take care of the family and the children, and often the extended family, the husband's parents sometimes. Right. And so I think the amount of unpaid labor is increasing because there hasn't been a census. There have been other data collection. Economic foundations in Rajasthan have shown that there are fewer official women cultivators, which is the name for a female who owns the land, but more laborers. And
even when they work on their own land, I mean, if they're working on their husband's land, how does the census count?
I think another thing that some recent studies showed is that there are more upper caste women working outside the home also,
right.
In agriculture, mostly on their own land. But then the scheduled caste land, by and large, is so small that women and children are working on that land, but then working on other land also.
Right.
And so that's the phenomena that it's describing.
I mean, one of the things that we've seen in our own work is that there's been so little investment because it's women. And so just to take a step back, this is a water data podcast, but what we are realizing is that you can't talk about water without ag and ag without labor, if that's kind of the primary determinant of what's going to be grown, right? But there's been so little investment in making ag labor kind of have less drudgery. And what my colleagues tell me is that there's just not enough types of like cutters and harvesters for cotton and chilies and all of this. It's still done manually.
Yeah.
And so then it's kind of the lowest in the hierarchy of jobs or livelihoods that anybody wants. And we're seeing this globally. Nobody wants to do work on the hot sun for very little money and do really painful work with their hands. I mean, why would anybody want to do that? And yet that's what shapes what agriculture gets done, and therefore that's what shapes the water outcomes. Is that...
Yeah, I think there are a number of interesting facets there. One is that over the last several decades, labor productivity has increased through mechanization. That's shown in the data. That's taken a dip in the last couple of years, actually. And I think in the area where I work with the rapid spread of drip irrigation, Rajasthan is a leader in drip irrigation, Karnataka also, that in the policy, though, that enabled that to diffuse the subsidy schemes, the incentive schemes, et cetera, there's no mention of labor involved. And so once the drip lines are laid on a field, you can't drive a tractor across that. You can't mechanize it, really. It demands labor. And because it also leads
But it's also a change of crops then.
It's a change of crops,
right,
and intensification typically, right? And so there's more crop being produced per unit area in an intensive way. And that does require labor. So I think that's where there's a kind of I would call it a labor subsidy going to the technology that is not politically neutral as a technology, but has a kind of political dynamic built in and demands.
Can you explain that a little more? Because it's really important to understand the speed. What do you mean by labor subsidy going to technology and it's not politically neutral?
Yeah, so if we Googled drip irrigation right now, or we look at policy documents, they would celebrate its economic efficiency and productive efficiency, right? Productive efficiency is water use efficiency. Economic efficiency is it's producing more crop per drop. And so if you have any kind of value on water and or electricity, there's more value being created. So in the kind of foundational aspects of political ecology is based on political economy. And in Marxian political economy, value is produced through labor. And that's often lost in neoclassical economics, where value can be produced through the exchange of goods. So my fundamental assumption is that value is produced through labor. So when I look at the success of drip irrigation, I think part of that success is through the labor input to it. And that's lost. And so that's what I mean about the labor subsidy, is that it's a subsidy because it's not part of the policy mechanism. It's not part of what is being discussed around the success of technology. I think if there was a better recognition that agricultural innovations rely on sociocultural systems and labor dynamics, they would be more effective and more successful in the sense of improving people's livelihoods.
Right. So basically, what the logic of the engineers is that if we subsidize drip systems and there was uptake or adoption by farmers, they would be able to grow more land, so their livelihoods would improve. What your studies have kind of shown is that, but it only happens because of women are working harder and nobody's accounting for that. But if we accounted for it, then what would we do if we fully understood that it's only happening because a bunch of women are working harder now?
I think it's one factor. So as we were saying, so in this area, and I think in other areas too, we see this in Karnataka, is that farmers were water limited, not land limited.
Right.
And so they expanded production. So we see that very clear in the statistics.
Right. So it doesn't solve the groundwater problem.
It doesn't solve the groundwater problem.
But it does give them more crop per drop. It improves livelihoods and income.
Yeah.
It doesn't solve the groundwater problem.
And if we put food security into that mix, then that's very important, right? But what I think it means,
they're not always growing food crops. In Karnataka, they're growing flowers and tulips.
That's right. Yeah.
Other stuff. So,
which is also
presumably
very interesting.
Getting them income and then they can buy food. But it's not.
Right. That's
it's solving a food security problem because there's more money in their pocket, but they're not growing more food.
Yeah. No, around here they're growing a lot of flowers, which is also a very interesting market. Those are being shipped to Europe and other places.
Exactly.
Yeah. But what I think it means would be thinking about the relationship between technical policy around drip irrigation and social policy, which are often like two silos.
Right.
And thinking about them together could be very effective, I think. And so one, it might be tying then programs that are aimed at enhancing women's livelihoods and education for children to agricultural policy more.
If you were promoting drip, what would you do simultaneously? Would you have training centers to make drip systems or harvesting systems or de-weeding systems so that women were not having to work with their hands, but they could work with like weed whackers and, is that what we mean?
One thing I think, first I would say is that I'm an academic, not a policymaker, but I would be very interested in having conversations with policymakers to say, this is what I've observed. This is what I think are the implications of that. What do you think are the implications? How might we talk about this to think about policy in new ways and the interrelationship between them? So that's, I think, the first thing I would think through. But I would also then think about what are the kind of programs for training, for education, thinking also that there's a time allocation, with all of this. So I don't think there are clear answers of like, this is the magic, the golden bullet or whatever the language is. But I think that thinking about these different policy spheres that are now disconnected, thinking about them more in a more connected way, would be an effective way to move forward.
Okay. We'll come back to solutions in a little bit, but let's continue talking about the surface water work that you've done in the large-scale infrastructure work, because we kind of understood what you've said about groundwater and how it's connected to the agriculture and labor in a very intimate way. And then the big solution, of course, that the government's promoted is the drip irrigation, and that has these problems of increasing of a labor subsidy by women and increasing the burden on them. But then the second set of solutions the government has proposed as well, let's get away from groundwater, particularly for drinking water, but let's get away from groundwater altogether and let's kind of promote more surface water-based supply. And then you've written a lot about what's happened with these surface water schemes. As you said a few minutes ago, when you actually speak to the engineers, they're very, very well-intentioned, right? When I've spoken to some of the lower-level irrigation engineers, I mean, some of them will talk about how all they ever dreamed was to bring water to their village. And that was their dream. That was their, and it's a very noble kind of a dream that they have. And yet, there are ways in which it goes horribly wrong, or I guess you would say that's not politically neutral as well. So can you unpack what you've learned about water infrastructure and these big projects?
Yeah, something you said there at the end made me think of this foundational geographer Gilbert White in the U.S. in the mid-20th century, University of Chicago, who found that he studied interventions by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that put in flood mitigation infrastructure around some of the major rivers in the U.S., the Mississippi, for instance. And what he found was that that infrastructure gave people in communities, so policymakers at the states level, even the federal level, a false sense of security. And then they developed
the floodplains.
They developed the floodplains. They built houses there. They built infrastructure, and those places were still prone to flooding. And so that's a central insight that I think about when I think about large-scale water infrastructure. That okay, what are the unintended consequences? What problems is it going to create? Infrastructure is often built to deal with drought and deluge, flooding and droughts, right? To be able to basically control nature in a way, and to take water that drops in the form of precipitation at one point in time and save it and transfer it to where it's needed at another point in time, very broadly speaking. So one, I think that, well, also in the case of India, that these are the idea of river linking that's going now in large scale transformation has been around for quite some time. Going back to the colonial period with Sir Arthur Cotton, and it's emerged at different moments in the contemporary period in the 70s and the 90s under Vajpayee. And now it's moving forward in certain ways. So I think that's very interesting. This return to kind of what I would say is supply side solutions to water scarcity. But the data aren't always clear if this is a long-term solution. Thinking about melting in the Himalaya, what's the time frame over which those glaciers are melting? So we have a surplus of water coming now, if you will. Right. We could problematize the idea of surplus also. Yeah.
I mean, already this year, somebody was telling me that parts of the Himalayas didn't, certain ranges didn't have any snowfall at all. So
right.
Yeah.
So that's shifting as well.
Yeah.
I've lost track of your original question. I think it was about the politics
about
embedded
infrastructure.
And
politics embedded in infrastructure.
Right. I think so. One thing I've also come to understand is that infrastructure decisions are not always, they're made politically often by the administrative service. They're not made always by the engineering service. And so in that way, some projects have a lot of path dependency. By the time that they're in process and unfolding and actually being constructed, sometimes the original basis for those no longer holds, but they're going to move forward anyway.
Right.
And that's where understanding that, I have much more sympathy for the political and economic and the historical dynamics within which engineers are operating. That they're at the government level are to carry out a project and not to necessarily problematize it. So they're within a system also. But I think they're all this is not just about water scarcity or demographic change, meaning water scarcity in India's population is projected to grow in certain ways, and that's going to lead to a kind of linear fashion of more water usage. That's been shown in other areas not to always be the case, right? So California has had tremendous population growth, but they use less water per capita now than they did in the 1990s because of conservation. So there's something else at play, and part of it is what I found in my work is a supply side economic growth, meaning that we know historically how important water is to economic growth,
right?
And we feel this on a daily basis. So if we're in a household that you get up in the morning and there's no water and you can't prepare yourself for the day, then that has a very negative impact on the individual.
On the kind of job you can take.
The kind of job you can take, whether you're on time, whether you're late, whether you're prepared, all of that. And especially if you're spending time fetching water in the evenings or trying to hire a tanker, and depending on your socioeconomic status of where you're getting your water.
If you're a rain-fed farmer, your income level is going to be completely different than if you're an irrigated farmer with guaranteed access. I mean, it's just, factor of 10
right, absolutely.
in income.
Yeah, and so I think though the challenge of the work I've done in Rajasthan is that the water infrastructure surface water infrastructure that's being built, much of it is being built to transfer water into urban spaces,
right?
Under the discursive framing that it's drinking water.
Right.
But then when you look at where the water, how it's used in urban spaces, it's commercial, it's industrial activity.
Right.
A very small proportion is actually drinking water. But that sounds better, I think, and maybe more complicated as a public messaging strategy.
Right.
And meanwhile, irrigation is expanding in some areas. Other areas, it's contracting. And so some of what I've studied in Rajasthan is a proxy for, I think, the other parts of the country where farmers are actually being asked and then kind of told to do more with less because this water needs to be sent to urban centers for drinking water. And so I've documented a number of areas that are in these former command areas that now that water is no longer for irrigation purposes; it's for urban purposes, drinking water purposes.
No, I mean, it's fascinating, this idea of urban water being equal to drinking water and therefore having the highest allocative priority. And then agriculture and then industries below that. But if the industry is part of the urban system, you're not turning off the tap in one or two places. Though we are seeing a really interesting kind of phenomenon emerge with a lot of industry where they're now buying out the domestic water of cities, the wastewater of cities.
Okay.
So that their allocative priority is effectively moved up to drinking water then. So if you're an industrial estate, which was then not part of the urban water allocation, your allocation is so kind of unreliable because you come after agriculture that if you want to actually make it more reliable, the cheapest way to do it is to buy out the sewage of cities. And so it's an interesting thing, and it would kind of then to be seen what implications that has or how that's working out. But I think it's an interesting solution. But tell me a little more about this water grabbing kind of thing, because how does this kind of a allocative priority of increasing the share of urban and having commercial and particularly IT parks and biotech parks and stuff falling into the city's share, how's that actually affecting farmers in the sense, engineers would argue, but that's a good thing. We're asking them to be more efficient. Agriculture is quote unquote highly wasteful. Why is that a bad thing?
Yeah, so I think So first, there are a couple of assumptions I think built in. Going back to what we were discussing previously around an assumption that the smallholder Indian farmer is a relic of the past and that will eventually go away under economies of scale. I think there's also a sense that agriculture is not very productive in terms of economic growth and leading to GDP growth.
Right.
And so
the productivity in rupees per meter cubed of agriculture is very low compared to
and
industry.
Human capacity, perhaps. And so I think there's whether it's an intention or whether it's viewed as a positive benefit, that by transferring some water out of these areas of irrigation, that will hasten a natural process anyway, that the people affected are better off moving into urban cities. And we see this like building new cities, right? Especially in this like corridor between Jaipur, Jodhpur, and Mumbai, where there have been a number of new cities trying to be created. So I think that's part of like the modernist vision of where India wants to be in terms of I'm thinking about being a development planner, going back to 5-year plans of where India wants to be in the next 50 years, for instance, from that perspective. And so I see that as viewed as a positive outcome. But in the meantime, there's a tremendous amount of human suffering that happens, I think, because people don't have the capacity, meaning agricultural communities don't have the capacity to do otherwise. And so in my own work, when they're told for the upcoming season that you are not to take any water out of this canal, we're going to police it. And if you do take it, there's going to be a problem. And to say the least, it could be handled much better, right? In terms of an off-ramp, giving farmers an off-ramp.
Do you have our episodes running in the background? If you're curious about a technical term that we use or an acronym we've forgotten to expand, check out our video episodes on YouTube. We have on-screen explanations that might be useful. So there's the short-term off-ramp and then the long-term off-ramp. But what you just said, if you're not getting water for this season because it's a drought year, on one hand, it's a reasonable thing because agriculture is the most flexible of all. But the very problem with us defining fixed allocative priorities and not defining it as a right system makes it difficult to then compensate farmers because you just don't get it. That's it.
Right.
And then because it's an allocative priority. And as opposed to the US, for example, with the Imperial Irrigation District and Southern California, where they can buy the water rights for the season from the farmers. So the farmers, at least their income, they may be bored that season because they can't do agriculture, but then their income is kind of maintained, right? And the way we've structured our water rights system almost forces the farmers into penury every time there's a drought.
Yeah, and that's where the dispossession part comes in. This is a kind of a theoretical framework, not to get too much into that, but that dispossession happens through economic means and extra economic means, we would say. So extra economic are policy mechanisms.
Like this one, which says that you just don't...
Like this one, right, exactly. And
your priority is second, so you just don't get it.
Yeah, and so what they did more specifically was that this is a reservoir that was developed as an irrigation reservoir that then, through a successive period of policy changes, was then transformed first discursively, meaning what they were calling it, into a drinking water reservoir, not for irrigation. And then that if there would be any surplus water in that reservoir at the end of the season, meaning as represented by a certain number of meters above sea level, which is how the amount of water is measured in the reservoir, then they would release any extra to farmers.
Right.
And so it shifted the dynamic to where this is no longer water for irrigation, it's water for urban purposes, and if there's any extra, you'll get the leftovers. But then that level of meterage never reached that level, actually. So by
let me just,
default.
Because this is the paper, and I've forgotten which journal it was in, but the paper on Jaipur, where you said it's a very subtle change, because it sounds like all they did was to say, well, irrigators get the water when the dam is at 309 meters above sea level. And they just said, no, it's not 309, it's 312. But it sounds like, it's just 3 meters. It sounds tiny. But the fact is that 312 is achieved only once every X number of years, while 309 might have been achieved every year.
That's right.
And that small, subtle difference, it sounds like a 1% change. But of course, we're talking about meters above mean sea level, not meters above the sill of the dam, firstly. So in terms of the height of the dam, it might be 25% of the, the total of the maximum reservoir level. And when you're then adding the frequency of how frequently the dam reaches that, it could be that now farmers are going from getting water every year to once every 3 years, right?
That's right.
That's what effectively happened in Jaipur. But because it happens in this very subtle, bureaucratic rule way, the pain that it inflicts on specific groups is kind of just then missed in the larger narrative.
Right, and that's right. And as you were giving the example of California before, where there were no formal rights, there are usufruct rights by use, but that were not formalized in any way. So those can be changed, and so that's how that was done. And another interesting factor of that reservoir, and I think this speaks to other reservoirs as well, is how any kind of surplus was quickly reallocated. And so I would think about this as there's a big bowl of water and there are more straws going into it, more and more. And so it's a continued production of scarcity.
Right.
There's never going to be
This is a hot, dry state. It's a desert.
Yeah, that's right.
That you're trying to put factories in and farms and horticulture and all kinds of stuff. And so the straws, there can be infinite number of straws that can be put there.
Absolutely. And as we were saying, it doesn't matter if you're middle class or upper middle class or a very small farmer. If you don't have water for the day, then there's not. It undermines your human capacity in an Amartya Sen way, right? Your fundamental capabilities cannot be realized when you don't have access to water on a daily basis. So I am fully in favor of that, but in this way now that reservoir is now part of the Eastern Rajasthan Canal project, and there are river diversions happening to be able to transfer more water into that, because the number of cities and municipalities has increased by year. They're increasing.
There's one other interesting thing in that paper that you said, which is you said a lot of these farmers, one of the reasons they get dispossessed or affected by dispossession is that they've made investments in their lands, either through polyhouses or drip irrigation systems. I mean, they've actually spent money on the assumption they were getting water. And then through these very subtle rule changes, their water is cut off. And then they are in debt. They can now, realize the income on the basis of which they made those investments. But the opposite would never happen for a factory. If an industry put up a 20,000 crore factory, the government would not be like, yeah, we decided you don't get the water anymore. And so the problem is, 50,000 farmers having invested 20 lakhs
That's right.
each would just be lost in the narrative. But one factory having put a 20,000 crore investment would not. And therefore, you don't notice what happens to small losses, or for them, big losses, but for a large number of people compared to one big industry which can now lobby, pay the government, buy off the corporate, the MLAs, whatever, to make sure that the rules, those subtle rule changes always happen in their favor.
Right.
Right. And that's sort of political economy 101, right? That one person who has a lot to benefit can afford to pay off the rule makers compared to 50,000 people who each lose small amounts of money.
Right.
And so that's one way in which this happens. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, and then that makes me think of the efforts to organize farmers, to unionize, right? I mean, you see in 2023 in Delhi where they blockaded, this is from Punjab for different reasons, but in similar kind of like collective action to get what they want.
But it has to be really bad for them to get to that point. I mean,
that's right.
There's lots of small indignities which happen every day, and they just, how many times can you collectivize?
Yeah, they'll absorb a lot of...
they absorb
a lot of contradictions. Yeah, and with the hope of next year will be better, that sort of thing. But you're right. I mean, the hardest, most tragic, stories that I witnessed were farmers who had made major investments based on expanding irrigation, and then lost those, and they were in debt for moneylender loans, and in some cases they would have to sell their land, to be able to pay off those loans.
I mean, so Trevor, these are really fascinating stories. And one thing that I observed in reading all of your papers was they are not accessible to the layperson. Even, I would say, a water enthusiast, somebody who cares about the topic, would find, not just yours, but I'm talking about the entire area of critical development studies, they're very much embedded in theory and kind of written for the academic audience. And that's, I understand the nature of the publication game. But I've often wondered, isn't it a little sad that these very, very rich insights are kind of lost to the policymaker, decision maker community? Wouldn't it be better if these things were not in silos? But then that insight sort of needs to be out there and said in simple terms that people who are very busy, that's not their main job, is to understand theories, should be able to absorb the basic, the basic points of what this very rich research has revealed. Why is it that there aren't more forums for the types of insights that you've done such painstaking work with, years and years and years of field work, interviewing people, following their lives, observing them? Why is it there isn't more of attempt to kind of reach generalist audiences? Or am I wrong? And there is.
I think it's a good question and a really valid one. I think there is increasing attempt to reach a more general audience. I think, as you know, the incentive structure in academia is not necessarily public-facing articles, but speaking to academic audiences. I think in my own work, I viewed my potential impact in terms of policy as in development sphere. So in the UK and the US.
So it's the development funding agencies who might pay attention potentially to
UN, and so I would say my most impactful work in that regard has been on drip irrigation, where I had a dialogue with the UNDP after some of my papers came out around drip irrigation policy, and thinking about the kind of like how it could be coupled with other incentives in terms around cropping, for instance, both on input prices and market prices, that would lead to more effective conservation. And as we know, drip irrigation hasn't led to water savings, but it's led to productivity, as we were saying before. So I think that's been impactful. But I think in like the kind of work I do generally, my work, but my colleagues' work, it has been impactful, like critical scholarship, thinking about critiques of fortress conservation, critiques in terms of on water around the hydrologic cycle that's been now informed with the socio-hydrology and the hydrosocial cycle, to think about that. So that's been very important, I think.
What happens now that we are seeing sort of a breakdown of the international order where you don't have the big USAIDs and so on funding a lot of the actual development work in many of these places, does there then need to be a different path because who are, for example, Indian critical scholars, who are they addressing? Are they addressing government, or are they also continuing to write for international audiences, but then that mechanism is now no longer existing?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of answers to that question. I think one, going back to the incentive structure in universities, is changing, but slowly. I think, as a research-intensive university where I am, researchers, tenure-track faculty need to be able to produce scholarship,
work, yeah.
Right? But there needs to be something also that says that, yes, you're producing scholarly work, but the impact you're having on society by participating in podcasts, by engaging with the government, by writing op-eds, by writing public-facing pieces is also very valuable. We're seeing some of that. I think some of us, myself included, have never been trained to do that.
Right.
And so that's part of the challenge, I think, with graduate education is like we need to be training our students to how to do this and to be, and that's important and is valued.
Yeah. And maybe all it needs is to write a simple language or do a little 5-minute talk in simple words for every paper that comes out. And it's maybe not be that,
like the plain language summary in science,
like
or whatever it is.
Plain language summary, but, in different format, in talk, put out slides, poster, whatever it is, so that the simple messages are out there.
Right. Yeah. And I think the conversation, for instance, there have been a number of pieces written by colleagues of mine that have made their way there or been, intended to be published there. Those have been impactful. I think also there is a hesitancy of people in my field to say, well, my job is to critique. And I think the critique is very important.
It is important.
But we need some people critiquing and some people translating critique.
I like to think of the critique as sort of a spiral that you critique. The next version of it is slightly better, but it has other problems. You critique those.
Mm-hmm.
But that you go up the spiral only if somebody's taking the critique and then iteratively improving. It doesn't make the critical scholarship ever go away, because whatever we do, somebody needs to look at it with critical eyes and say, hey, is it making sense? Or these new problems have emerged and then we try to fix them. But you can only go up a spiral staircase if that step up is kind of there each time.
Yeah.
And that requires translation. It requires engagement between the critical scholars and the practitioners. And I was telling you earlier that one of the reasons we started Well Labs was my personal frustration that we have very rich insight. The rich insight doesn't translate into program design or project design. And unless there's a very explicit link made to kind of say that, okay, we're going to take this critique on board and think very carefully about how do we alter and repurpose programs and projects in order to do that. But that process, I mean, I use the word design thinking, saying design thinking, but informed by all of the scholarship. But unless we have that, and you have these boundary, and this idea of boundary organizations has been there for a long time. It's not, it's not new, but we try to do it in new ways. In Well Labs, we work in both groundwater dependent areas, which are drylands, and we also work in canal command areas. Now, given all of the insights that we have, and we've learned from all of this critical research, what are some possible new experiments that we could try, or new ways of designing programs that we could attempt that would actually be responsive to critical scholarship rather than ignoring it and just trying to do our own stuff?
Well, that's a big question.
I mean, small baby steps.
Right. I think, we were talking about this before we started the podcast today. I'm talking about graduate education and links between the public and private sector. I think that's part of the future of graduate education, for instance, is solutions-oriented. I won't call it training, but partly training, because graduate education is training, but within boundaries, especially at the master's level, that enable students to ask, I'll call them medium-sized questions that can be answerable, that advance scholarship, but also advance our understanding in what would we do differently, what could be done differently, and not all work is going to do that. But I think that we have an increasing number of students who start graduate education, and they want to, what we would call, engage in a politics of praxis. They want to like be not just practical; they want to like do something and be fulfilled in that way, and to be engaged in a process that doesn't only describe the world, but help to make it a better place. And I think I try to say, well, in describing it, you are making it better. So that's important, but there are other ways to do that too. And so I think, that's part of it. And I think one thing that I feel like, I've been to a number of conferences here in different parts of India where the audience has been very heterogeneous, academic, NGO, government. And so I think that is done much better here than in the U.S. We often have conferences where it's all academic.
Right.
Maybe some are more open, depending if it's like, say, energy reform or water reform. There are some that are oriented that way if they're coming out of a public policy research institute within a university. So we do have people who do that. And I think I would say at my own university, there's an increasing recognition of explaining the value proposition of university education generally, and that's leading to incentives to help us as researchers get our research out there. So that is changing, but it's slow.
Yeah.
But I think it's moving in a positive direction.
I think one of the reasons why we have more heterogeneous conferences here is because this is sort of the epicenter of the development work, right? You're not just researching it, but the people that are practicing it are also resident here.
Yeah.
While if you're in the global north, you might have a development studies conference, but nobody who's actually making the change, other than donors, few donors, they're not actually there. So it tends to automatically become a little more academic in nature. But I think that it's still different if you're structuring, and there was a LinkedIn post about it just a couple of days ago. If you design conferences where the practitioners are there to just listen to the scholars, as opposed to they're there as sort of equal participants to say, hey, we've been trying these experiments, and then the scholars respond, and it's a little more of a dialogue, because then it makes scholarship itself a little more responsive to what people are struggling with, rather than scholarship being completely only responsive to theory, right? And theory building. And it forces both. I mean, you have to still embed in theory because that's the nature of academic scholarship, but it's doing both theory building, but also more responsive to what practitioners do. And maybe that's one way designing these unconferences, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah, I think so. And there's been interesting, going back to qualitative research, there have been a number of really interesting, I think, positive innovations around something called event ethnography. So focusing on, say, an event like a conference as a thing to study in and of itself.
And seeing how can you do that better.
And how to do it better, exactly.
Transfer of ideas in both directions a little better.
Right, that's right. Yeah, and there's been a long-standing critique of that I think we've effectively gotten away from of scholars basically telling others what to do.
Right.
We've shifted away from that, and I think there's also in that then another challenge of like, okay, then how do we do this, right? And I think what you just described in terms of inviting policymakers not just as guests and as participants to present their own work and challenges.
I think there's another thing that I'm also seeing emerging, which is the startup ecosystem in India. There's a lot of ag startups or agripreneurs that are called, so and some of those are trying to actually solve some of these problems, whether around reducing the labor burden for women, so on and so forth. And it was interesting this year at the annual Inequality program, which has traditionally been a conference in India, which has brought together the more scholarly people with the more practitioner type of community. And one of the things that I saw this time, I thought for the first time, was a lot of the startup community and the agri startups. It's just interesting to bring them into it because they've otherwise traditionally been very, very blinkered in their approach, saying, we're solving this one very specific problem of like making drip irrigation systems better, or, being able to spray this thing in this particular crop in this particular way, but without understanding the larger implications of what happens with labor, are there health issues that you're worsening because you're designing in a particular way. And I think forcing these very, very diverse type of actors into a single room probably is an important way in which critical scholarship can kind of engage, because then, but not in a way of, we're going to tell you why you guys are all wrong, but
Yeah.
which often, I mean, one of the
Yeah.
reasons that I feel scholars don't engage in those spaces is also the world is a lot messier, that you, as you well know, but then it's also much harder to speak to people who are coming with very, very, very practical problems. So to have to be forced to stretch and talk to those people is hard. I mean, a lot of people were like, okay, my incentives just don't extend to have to do all of that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, and that's
Comes back
where,
to the incentives in academia, I guess.
Yeah, and I guess incentives for people not in academia as well, and the kind of like social, imbroglios, like challenges that we've faced as humans forever. To some degree, I think we can't socially engineer all of them,
right?
But we can't not try either. To some degree.
I like to be optimistic and say, if there was more dialogue, right, we would learn to do better. For example, if there were problems with dams and the dams are causing ecological problems, for example, if we studied them and put them out and everybody got together and said, okay, let's first acknowledge there's a problem and then try to brainstorm on how to solve it, I'm sure that process is going to result in a solution which is better than the dam people pretending we don't ever need data on the ecological side, and the ecological people sitting in a room by themselves and just muttering about how terrible engineers are. I mean, the dialogic process has got to result in something which is at least one step better, like the equivalent of moving one step up the spiral staircase instead of in a circle. And surely that's got to be better rather than the status quo.
Yeah, certainly, I think so. I think, going back to thinking about the degrees of freedom within which government engineers operate around projects, I think they're very circumscribed. They're very narrow.
Right.
A few years ago, I would have answered your question. Probably I would have thought about like training. How do we train engineers? How do we train social scientists to be more interdisciplinary? I think that's important. Then there's the government institutions that operate like fiefdoms sometimes, and they control their territories, and they don't want any cross-fertilization happening. So I think there's that challenge also.
There is, but if we talk about it openly, then we can maybe figure out, well, who's ever broken one of those fiefdoms? How did they manage to do it? And then I think you're forcing kind of it into a problem-solving kind of thing. And I like the idea of critical people critiquing, but also engaging with people who want to solve, so that I think you get a much richer type of problem solving than if you leave the problem solving to engineers and techies and then you just keep critiquing.
Yeah, no, that's true, I think, right? Again, then there are scholars who are going to be very good at their critique, and it'll be up to others to take up their critique. But there's an important moment of translation there. And I think, in my position, I think the translation part is some of the most interesting aspects, right?
I mean, the reason I stopped being just an academic and started Well Labs was to create a space for translation.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's a very dynamic space to be in.
Fantastic. I mean, Trevor, it's been a really fascinating conversation. I hope that it's really inspired a lot of young people who've never kind of even thought about these ideas of beyond water and ag, to looking at, what are the labor constraints and institutional constraints. So at least go and kind of give it a little bit of thought. But let me ask you for a source of inspiration, where if you were starting your career on some of these topics today, what kind of inquiry would you engage in, given where we are in 2026?
So on a similar topic of what I researched, what would be the next horizon in that way? One is, and my students were trying to do this, is harness the data revolution and the AI revolution. I don't think anybody really knows where that's going. We've seen some insights. In some ways, there have been some very interesting discoveries. In others, it's being used to sell people things, and create better adverts on what we might want or not know what we want. So I think that's part of it. I don't want to be naive about this, but I think from a farmer's perspective, having data and information isn't necessarily knowledge, but it can lead to knowledge, and knowledge is empowering. So I think that can create collaborations as well, to where something we've been trying to do in research for decades is to empower research participants to have more agency, right? Develop capacity, develop capabilities. So I think that's kind of lofty, but I think that's would be a good direction for things to go.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. This is actually a new setup today.
That's great.
We've changed the setup a little bit, but thank you for inaugurating this with us. But just a fascinating conversation, and I really hope that we have just many more people at least starting to think. I mean, I think removal of ignorance is sort of the first step. And
Yeah.
I hope at least that for many of us, this is kind of opening out a new window into ways of thinking. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of the Water Data Podcast. Thank you for listening till the end. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe to the Well Labs YouTube channel and share this episode with your friends and colleagues. You can find the Water Data Podcast on all major podcast platforms. Until then, stay curious and stay connected. Thank you.